everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. I am your host, Carolyn Hayes, and this is a podcast where I talk to film creators about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today, I'm speaking with cinematographer Alan Gwisdowski to talk about the film HONK for Jesus, Save Your Soul, written, directed, and produced by Adamme Ebo. I saw this film at the 2022 Sundance Film Festival, and if you're familiar with my podcast, you would have seen that I spoke to Adamme and her sister Adamme, who also co-produced the film, and Sterling K. Brown and Regina Hall, who played the lead characters. And Alan being the DP, I'm very excited to talk to him because the way how this film is shot is very interesting because it's not a typical straight-on feature. It has like different components because there's the actual filming of the characters, and then there's a component of where it's being recorded like a documentary, and then there's scenes where it's kind of like a YouTube version of the characters themselves because they're speaking from a sermon. So when we get into, we'll get more into that into the film. But as usual, I'd like to ask Alan to talk a bit about himself and what got him into becoming a cinematographer. So Alan, what led you down the path of becoming a cinematographer?
Well, I was always around cameras growing up. My dad worked in local TV news. He was a director, producer of broadcast journalism. So I grew up around cameras, but then I got into making skateboard videos when I was younger. So that's the first time I picked up a camera to record my own footage and really like to get creative with it. So I steered away from the broadcast journalism, really got into making creative images, started doing photography and combining images in Photoshop. And then I decided to go to film school. I went to Emerson College. And it's really there that I found that the role of DP is what I wanted to do, because I like working with cameras and lighting, but I didn't necessarily like directing the actors or the talent. So working with a director who's going to do that aspect of it, while I get to create the images, that's really where I fell in love with it.
And for this film, because I've seen in your IMDb that you've worked on some different genres. So to me, HONK for Jesus is kind of like a mix up of different genres because it's like a typical feature film, but then it also includes a bit of documentary aspects, and then as well as YouTube and or what we would call like it's like YouTube, but then also this kind of where it's like you're filming the recording of a YouTube video. So what was it about this film that made you want to work on this particular project? Because it's different from what you've done before.
Well, it is different from what I've done before, but it's kind of a mix of several projects or several types of projects that I've done before. When I read the script and saw that there was a documentary portion to it, but it also needed to have the traditional narrative. Sorry, I have a helicopter going right over me.
It's okay.
The two distinct styles that needed to be created were things that I had done in the past, but they hadn't necessarily been put together into a single project before. So that was very interesting to me. Doing the faux documentary, I like to call it faux documentary or fake documentary instead of mockumentary, because we'd like to treat that footage as if it were real and take it as seriously as possible. So as opposed to something like The Office, where there's the camera is really accentuating jokes and doing like pop zooms on punchlines and stuff like that, what we really like to do is treat the camera work and the lighting as seriously as possible and let the comedy come from the characters and the ridiculous situations that they end up in. And this was a technique and something that I had developed over the years working with Tony Yacenda on several short projects, and also American Vandal, the show for Netflix, which just happened to be a big influence for HONK for Jesus. So even before I came into the project, that was a reference that Adamme had already talked about.
And you talked about The Office and how The Office, like their filming style as a mockumentary, is more about using, as you said, the camera angles and the filming style itself as a comedic element within the story. As where for this, as you said, is a fake documentary, but it's fake in that it's not one that's going to be premiered as an actual documentary, but it's filmed in the fact like it could be used as actual footage for a real documentary if they wanted to. So how did you go about approaching like working with Adamme Ebo, deciding which scenes were going to be for the documentary footage and which scenes were going to be for the actual film Honk for Jesus itself?
So in the script, it would be noted whether or not a specific scene should be captured in documentary, or we're calling it cinematic mode, which is the traditional narrative style that is outside of the documentary. So most of those distinctions were noted in the script, but then there were several scenes that needed to be covered in both ways because it was going to cut back and forth.
Right.
So whenever it came to those scenes, we basically covered it from top to bottom in the documentary form and also in the traditional narrative form, and then left it up to the edit to where that was actually going to be showcased, or where it was going to be placed in. There were several scenes that we knew for sure were going to be 100% documentary. Some scenes were going to be 100% cinematic because there's no reason for the documentary cameras to be there. For example, like them, Trinity and Lee Curtis Giles, like at home at night, like they wouldn't invite the documentary cameras into their bedroom. So those scenes were covered as if it was their real lives behind the documentary. When it came to the documentary footage, we really wanted to set in place rules that we would follow. Basically, what are the decisions that Anita, the documentary filmmaker in the movie, what are her decisions, creative decisions as a documentarian that she would want to make for her film? So we set those rules, and then anytime we would go to the documentary style, we basically had like a cheat sheet or a guideline of like what these angles or camera moves, what lenses, should it be handheld or is it an interview? All those things kind of listed out already, so that we knew whenever we're going to that style, this is the distinct look that's going to be created for that.
I was actually going to ask you about that, if there was a difference in the camera lens and the specific cameras used for the cinematic versus the documentary, and even for those used as the YouTube footage of the sermons, because I did notice that there's a slight difference in the grain and like the way how the light kind of like permeates through the lens. So how did you go about choosing which lens to use for the scenes and for the different modes?
For the documentary modes, one of our biggest influences was the documentary Marjo, about a real child pastor in the 70s who basically has a camera crew follow his life, and he reveals to the cameras that he is a hypocrite and doesn't actually believe the stuff that he's doing. But it's a very verite style documentary where the camera, it's on zoom lenses, it's handheld, it's moving around a lot, reframing constantly. And that was our biggest influence for the documentary style. So we decided to go with spherical lenses for the documentary, mainly using zoom lenses. And then, for the most part, stay in a handheld look. So then to juxtapose that for the cinematic look, we went with almost entirely static camera work, except for when we did have to move the camera, we went with a really smooth look, either dolly or on a gimbal. And then we also used anamorphic lenses for the cinematic look. So the documentary footage is actually cropped to an aspect ratio of 14:9, so that we could bring it even further away from the 240 crop for the cinematic look. And another reason for that is because the YouTube style sermon footage, we actually used the old Sony Betacams that the church had. So they provided us with some B-roll of the crowd. We actually weren't able to fill the crowd with extras, mainly due to COVID. And the church was under repair, so they weren't currently doing any sermons. So they provided us with some footage of their past sermons where the camera's sweeping over the crowd, it's a whole packed audience, and we used their same cameras to shoot the reverse of that with Sterling on stage. So that footage with him on stage cutting with the crowd, it's old, really dirty SD footage, and it's natively 4:3 aspect ratio. So to bring our documentary footage a little closer to that, we cropped the sides in and went to a 14:9 aspect ratio, and decided to go for a more video kind of look for the documentary. And then the cinematic mode tried to separate that and go for a more traditional kind of film look, added some grain and a CinemaScope aspect ratio.
Okay, so I didn't know that the footage of the congregation was like footage from the actual church itself, and that actually kind of ties into the question that I've been really wondering is because like I'm from the Caribbean, so like our churches are built slightly different to churches in North America, but the way so there's a very specific way to like when we're filming church sermons. And it's slightly different because like the architecture is different, so the cameras can be placed in like different locations, because like a lot of our churches have like really high ceilings and they're like super open because like it's so sunny, we get like a lot of natural lighting. But like for the church where you filmed, it's like very dark, and because there's one thing, there's a lot of wood, there's like a lot of mahogany, and they use like a lot of velvet, like there's a lot of dark burgundy velvet for the seating, and then there's like the royal blue in the background and stuff. So like how did you go about setting up, since you said that you use their footage, that means you would have had an idea of where they set up their cameras already. So like how did you go about like making sure that the angles they use for their original footage matched with the footage that the camera angles that you use, not only for the sermons but for the scenes where like Regina and Sterling are talking to the camera for the full documentary segments? Because I was interested to see, like I was really wondering, like how did you go about not only lighting this church, because it's lighting for cinema for one thing, and that's different than lighting for a regular church sermon. You know, like you have to make sure you get enough lighting so that the audience can see the characters in a way that works on the screen. Whereas for church, like they're lighting specifically for the audience to get a specific impact for the sermon. So like, how did you go about working around that with your setting up with the cinematographer, with the cameraman and the lighting, and also with Adamme and Sterling and Regina with like just working out the lighting and everything with that?
So we actually worked with the head of media for the media department for the church. And he showed us the positions for the cameras where they typically would record the sermons from. There's a straight on camera right in the middle of the sanctuary that would produce a wide shot and a follow single. So no matter where they walked on stage, the camera can just from that pivot point follow them for the entire sermon. And then there was a couple more cameras that would be placed more on the side, and then also looking back towards the crowd. And those were the four typical positions for that specific church's sermons. But then we also watched a bunch of other YouTube references of just other sermons at mega churches around the US, and decided on how we mainly wanted to cover Sterling being on stage, and knowing that we had to work within the limits of not having extras to fill the entire church. So what specific angles would work for us to be able to sell the portions that we had to record versus what we also just gathered from the church. And then when it came to the lighting, working with the media department from the church, they showed us basically how they had a pre-recorded segments of a sermon. So if it was something where the pastor is at the pulpit and it's the opening of a sermon, there would be a specific lighting for that. And then if they were going to the communion pool, which is a totally separate area and kind of elevated up onto the next level, for baptisms, they would do a different lighting setup for that, and so on. So there was, I would say like 10 to 12 pre-programmed lighting setups that they had for sermons. So we looked through all those and decided which ones were relatively in the ballpark of what we were looking to do, and then based on the levels that were presented as a baseline from those pre-recorded settings, then I would take that and then augment it to feel or to fit how we needed for the movie, whether I needed a little bit more light and I needed to amp it up, or if we wanted to just take light away from a certain section because it was distracting, or just needed to shape it. It was all based on what they would actually do, but we just augmented it to fit our situation a bit better.
And going into this, did you have any idea that it would be kind of like so technical, that church sermons and the way how they operate with their media teams, it's so technical, because it's like a big production, right?
Yeah,
It's like the way you're talking, like you would think it's like a concert event or something, but it's for a church, and it's kind of like what the film is about. Is kind of talk about how church has now become this big production about always being on and performing and always looking their best and stuff. Like, what was your reaction when you sat there and you think, oh wow, this is a production in and of itself?
Yeah, because I went to church when I was young, but there was no media in those churches. It was just the sermon itself, and then that was it. So there was lights on the stage, but there was no real production to it. So it was definitely a different level of thinking about it. Like, I have seen images on TV and I had seen the references, but I had never been to a mega church that had a full-on production team, cameraman and lighting department. So yeah, that was definitely an eye-opener to me, to see how big that portion of the church is, and how many people work in the media department alone. So it was interesting to see. And then once I had really dove in and was working with their head of the media department, it was kind of just like any other TV production that I had been around. It just happened to be their focus is on the church. So it wasn't too far off of being like a news station when I was a kid, going to see like my dad work on the local 6 o'clock news.
That's so interesting, because like I think especially for like us, we're millennials, right? Yeah, like coming from like growing up in church where, like as you said, there was no camera. Like the only time we would probably have a camera would be if it's like a special occasion like Christmas, Christmas event or something, and you'd only have like the standing cameras. There's like the camera in the middle on the tripod, and that's it. And like I think it also has to do with how technology has progressed, because everything is so interconnected with the internet now. Like everything is made to show for the internet, and it has a global perspective. So like we kind of like how we saw the evolution of internet coming from dial-up to Wi-Fi, is like churches is kind of the same way it's been evolving. And I love how you guys explore that in the film, because like you get to see how everything is a spectacle now. Even worship is a spectacle now. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you now, for this is something I'm always interested in with regards to like a film, with regards to like cinematographers and costume designers, because I know sometimes costume designers and cinematographers have to work pretty closely, because like you have to take into consideration the materials and the colors being worn by the characters, and how like that could appear on screen, because like some colors don't show up as well on screen depending on like its material, if it's like satin, cotton, linen, or whatever. So like how did you go about working with the costume designer to work with the specific scenes? Because there's some scenes where like in the church, like Sterling's and Regina's clothing is a bit more muted, whereas outside they're wearing, I think, more flashier clothes. Like a lot of the clothes have more like iridescent colors. Like my favorite sequence is the one close to the end where she's wearing my makeup, and she has on this yellow dress, and I'm like, that there's a message being given in what she's wearing in particular. So like how did you go about working with the costume designer?
For the most part, we just let the costume designer run wild with these extravagant church outfits. There was a few colors that we would stay away from, dark reds and bright reds, for one, mainly just the symbolism there, as opposed to anything that the camera could handle. But for the most part, we let the costume designer run wild. And Adamme had a very strong opinion about the clothing. So unless there was something that stood out to me, like a pattern that would create the moire effect or something like that, then I would let them pretty much choose what they wanted to do costume wise, knowing that we really wanted those colors to pop in the end. So when it came to the color grade, we wanted to go for a really warm feel. Even when it's overcast, we wanted it to feel hot. So we went for some browns in the shadows and make it feel warm overall, and then muted there's a lot of greenery in the background. So we muted the greens to subdue that so it didn't stand out too much. And then we specifically, a lot of times, would select the color of the outfits because for the most part, they're very bright, vibrant outfits. So it wasn't too hard for us to pinpoint those in the color correction and bring them out selectively to give the clothing a little more of a saturated pop.
And there's a particular scene where I think the difference in like not only the tone of the film but the costume and the lighting really kind of really stands out. And that's the scene where Lee Child and Trinity meet the Sumters, and they're in this room, and it's like mostly like this muted gray, but it's more like it's more modern because there's like, you know, like the crystals and the pewter and the silver, and they're wearing like similar colors. Whereas Trinity and Lee Charles are kind of standing out because their clothing is more flashy. So for you, like I always see like cinematography is about telling a visual story, you know, it's about translating what's happening in the film, but through colors and lighting and like camera placement and everything. So for you and for that scene, like what were you trying to convey to the audience in that scene?
That's a good question. That scene in particular, it's a face-off. It's 2 versus 2, and we wanted to keep it that way until Mrs. Sumter kind of gives her first dig, and really singles out Trinity. So that's the change from the 2-shot to a single, and we really start to see the personal hatred that happens at that moment. So we started off with camera stays static the entire time, and it's opposing 2 shots. They're working together. Each couple is on a side, and they're on a team, and we wanted to make it. We showed the profile 4-shot where you can see all of them just squared off directly with each other, and then besides that, it's a 2-shot in both directions, static camera squared off, and you can see that each side, they are working as a team at that point. And then once Mrs. Sumter gives that first dig about the congregants choosing where they're going to go, then we wanted to get in closer and really show that Trinity there's a lot going on in her mind at that point. So we wanted to focus on her eyes and see that she's darting back and forth between the 2 of them, and really trying to think of like what it is that she's going to say next. Because a lot of it is in the conversations that the church people have. They're putting on a nice face and trying to still be as polite as possible, even when they're mad. And they try to give these subtle digs while presenting a smile. So we wanted to get in closer there to see her eyes and see the fury behind them, but that she's still putting on a smile and trying to be as polite as possible in this argument that she's having.
Yeah, that scene is so familiar to me, because like women would be like, you know, like you gotta be decorous, keep your composure, but you just be like, I'm killing you with kindness right now. It's like,
Yeah.
basically, that scene is great to me because I just love Nicole and Regina's like that they call it a face off. It's almost like a showdown at noon, at high noon. If it was a Western, they would be the two gunslingers meeting at noon. So I know we have to wrap it up, but I have one little nerdy question to ask. And so like there's this scene close to the end. Like I talked about the scene where she's wearing yellow, but this is also another face off where like we're really getting to see what is really the whole crux of the matter. Like why are they doing this documentary? And is like the camera pulls out, and this is where it's in cinematic mode, and we get to finally see the videographers doing the full documentary. And I had to ask, I'm like, are those 2 men doing the videography for that? Are they the actual videographers who are doing the operation for the documentary aspect filming? Are they the actual filmmakers? I was just like, I wonder if they really are.
No, they're not. They're actors standing in as cameramen.
Okay.
So the way we designed that one, that scene in particular, for all of the documentary stuff, we would plot out where we wanted the cameras to be for the documentary portion. And then for this scene, in particular, we had to be very precise because we knew that they were going to in the end be on camera for the cinematic mode.
Right.
So based on where our actors needed to be and how the blocking of the scene turned out, we figured out where we wanted to place the documentary cameras, where they would be recording from. So we wanted to have one across the street, and we wanted to have one up close to the car for when Khalil pulls up. There was also some very specific framing that we had to keep in mind, because we had to shoot a lot of the stuff out on the sidewalk. We actually had to shoot in 2 different areas because we had a real main road with live traffic that we were not able to control, because it was the main thoroughfare in the area. So anything facing out towards the road, we had to do on the sidewalk of the real road. So you had live traffic driving in the background, but then anything that was facing to where we saw the church in the background, that was actually in the church parking lot about 100 feet away. And there was a parking lot sidewalk that we could use there to stage, have the car pull up, create our own minor traffic jam there, and not have the equipment and crew in the road. So we were splitting these 2 different areas that we needed to record in. So half the scene took place in one, half the scene took place in the other. And there was very specific angles that we could use without giving it away that we were in 2 different places. So right off the bat, we designed where we wanted Trinity to be, where the car would pull up right in front of her, and that Lee Curtis is like another 40 or 50 feet down the sidewalk. And where would the 2 documentary cameras be to cover this portion of the documentary? So once we found their marks, we recorded that footage first, and we used we're using a red Gemini as our main A and B cameras. So we used that same camera for documentary and for cinematic mode, but we just changed settings and lenses and the LUT that was in camera for the overall look. So we recorded the documentary footage first, found out where exactly those cameras should be. Once we knew where that was, then once we switched over to the cinematic mode, we brought in our extras with the fake camera and put them on those same marks that we were actually recording from. So at that point, we didn't have to try and keep them out of the frame or hide them from the cameras. We knew that they were there and they were supposed to be on film at that point. So every documentary shot is from the same position that you see the documentarian on camera in the cinematic mode. It's something that we once we know where those things take place and where they should be, then crossing the line is forgiven at that point, and you understand where everything is taking place, where the cameras are, and at that point just let the scene play out with the characters. And we started to mix the documentary and cinematic mode, which we were specifically keeping separate for most of the film, handheld zoom lenses versus the static anamorphic. Once we got to this scene, we combined those 2 styles, because at that point everything's out on the table and it's no longer only being seen by documentary or their personal lives. It's all coming together as one at that point. So we decided to mix everything and lay their dirty laundry out on the table.
Great. Thank you so much for talking to me, Alan. This is great. I'm always interested to know how, I love films, but I think slightly more interested to know how they're made. And being able to speak with you and other creatives helps me, and I think other people appreciate just how much work goes in to creating regular films, but then also a film like this where there's so much, where there's just so much more to it, because it's not just a regular film. You're telling technically 3 different stories at the same time, and so much goes into just one shot. Because that scene, the last scene we were talking about, that was just one scene. That was just one time we got to see the videographers, and so much went into just choreographing and planning and blocking that one scene. So thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The nerding me is very happy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think this is it. Is there anything that you would like audiences to know? Is there any other projects that you're working on? Because you mentioned American Vandal, and I think the publicist, you also mentioned you worked on a film called Players as well. Is there
Yeah.
anywhere else that other people can find more of your work?
Yeah. So Players is actually the same creators as American Vandal, Tony Ascenda and Dan Peralt. I've worked with them for years and went to college with them at Emerson. But we did this show last year. It came out on Paramount Plus, premiered earlier this year. It's all available on Paramount Plus now. All episodes are streaming. Came out a couple months ago. It's also in the faux documentary space. It's about an esports team following their road to their first championship. Kind of in the vein of the F1 series Drive to Survive and Michael Jordan documentary The Last Dance, but following an esports team. And it's in a similar way. We tried to keep it as authentic as possible. That one we used many more cameras than we did on Honk for Jesus. We ended up actually using 40 plus cameras for the different styles in that one. But that one's available on Paramount Plus. And then I also have another movie just happened to be premiering the same weekend as Honk for Jesus called Out of Office. That one's on Comedy Central.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.